All right. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. So let's go ahead and before we get going, we'll go ahead and start out with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, we just thank you for this Sunday morning, beautiful day and message, and just pray that you'd help that sink into our hearts and minds, that we'd be able to live our lives in a way that's glorifying and honoring to you. And as we look at these words from Francis Schaeffer, that you just touch our hearts and our minds, help us to be that much more effective witnesses to the world around us. And we ask it all in Jesus' name, amen. So before I start with the video this morning, I actually had this really interesting quote. Because as we've been looking at so many of these worldviews, one of the big things is it takes away the dignity of humanity. Because really the Bible is the only thing that gives not only a reason, but a dignity to the specialness of man, that we were created by a loving God, specially created by him. And I just love this quote by C.S. Lewis. This is, how many, I assume many of you guys have read the Chronicles of Narnia. And this is a quote when, to give the context, it's the Prince Caspian goes to Aslan, sorry. And he goes over to him and he's trying to find out, where his people came from, and come to find out his people were pirates that were marooned on an island that had a portal to Narnia. And so his people went through this portal, and he's disappointed because he's like, well, I didn't really want to come from pirates and terrible people. And Aslan provides him with this. He says, "You come from Lord Adam and Lady Eve," said Aslan, "and this is both honor enough to erect the head of the poorest beggar, yet shame enough to bow the shoulders of the greatest emperor on earth. Be content." And I just thought that is such a powerful way of saying it, that really brings the whole aspect of the specialness of man, yet enough to be humbled that we are still sinners. All right, so, and I'll ask this before I get the video started here. How many of you did the homework? Oh, we have one person. Really? Only one person? We got two. All right, two people. All right, so now you guys have a new homework assignment for this week. It is up on the Mighty Network. If you need me to repost it on there, please tell me, and I will get it back on there.
You probably forgot because we weren't getting graded on.
So we find a grade here and start grading people on it then? Yeah. Oh, cancel. This one is a really good one in the personal peace and affluency.
And affluence. Now, because I'm going to use these terms over and over again in this episode, let me define them carefully, and I'd urge you, please listen with care. As I use the term personal peace, I mean I want to be left alone. And I don't care what happens to the man across the street or across the world. I want my own lifestyle to be undisturbed, regardless of what it will mean even to my own children and grandchildren. Now that's what I mean by personal peace. Affluence means things, 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 always more things, and success seen as an abundance of things. In the early 60s, a whole generation had been injected by the teaching that reason leads only to pessimism in the area of the meaning of life and of any values. Students have been hearing this from the professors for a long, long time.
Understood, interpreted, one therefore is...
As a matter of fact, there was a generation that had never been taught anything else. But there was an inconsistency here, because most of these professors who taught that life had no meaning and there were no fixed values, they didn't live that way. They were living in the memory of the past. But we should not have been surprised that at a certain point of time, one generation would act, really act, upon what they had been taught. These students looked around them, and they saw these two horrible values of personal peace and affluency being on every side, and they revolted. And that revolution was Berkeley, 1964. Looking back into that which is now past history, we don't understand where we are today unless we take a moment to understand the flow through Berkeley of 1964. They really wanted to escape the two values of personal peace and affluency. And they did it in two different ways. First of all came the drug scene, the hippie scene. And we've already seen in a previous episode that Aldous Huxley said that as reason humanistic reason doesn't give a meaning to life, and we can't find objective truth, give drugs to well people in order that they might try to find truth inside of their own head. The hippie world followed this, and they followed it very explicitly. It was an ideology to them. Let's not make any mistake. Back in those days, it was really an ideology. They really believed in it. They really believed that if you could just take and put drugs into the drinking water, LSD into the drinking water of the reservoirs of the cities of the world, and you had enough people turned on, that civilization's problems would be solved. They believed it with all their heart.
Getting high with the help of your friends. It's a very powerful message.
About the same time at Berkeley, there arose a second element in this attempt to escape these two terrible values of personal peace and affluency. This was the free speech movement. At first, the free speech movement on Sproul Plaza was neither left nor right. It was simply a desire, a demand that they have a right to have freedom, to have political rallies on Sproul Plaza.
And by God, people, we have to push Reagan right back to the wall, and if we have to, we got to push him right through the wall. And we got to tell him, no, baby, this is our university.
But quickly, it slipped into the New Left, following Marcuse. Marcuse was a German philosopher, a Marxist, and at that time he was teaching at San Diego. This spread over the whole world. We can think, for example, of the Paris riots in 1968. Here they are seeking freedom from these two values. They had the right analysis. Let me say that as somebody who was older. They had the right analysis. This was where our society was, with just two terrible values of personal peace and affluency. But the tragedy was they tried the wrong solutions. The drug culture came to its height at Woodstock at the festival there in 1969. But in Altima, in 1969, there was another festival, and the Hells Angels, who were hired to police the ground, killed at least one man. And the Rolling Stone, the magazine, came out and quoted someone after that as saying, "We've lost our age of innocency." The drug culture was finished. It was completely finished after the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970, which ended so ugly, in such an ugly fashion in Europe. After that, drug taking changed. Mind you, not less people taking drugs unhappily, but no longer taking them as an ideology. The unhappy thing is probably more people are taking drugs and taking them at a younger age. But drug taking as an ideology was absolutely done. The New Left went the same way, gradually ground down. It brought forth naturally violence in the United States, violence in Europe, and the idealistic young people really didn't like the violence, that it just reasonably and naturally brought forth. In 1970, the radical students bombed the University of Wisconsin lab building, killing a graduate student. Bombs continue to be planted in the United States, and a small, hard core of radicals continues to exist. But the violence of the New Left, climaxing in the bombing of this laboratory building, made most young people in the United States no longer see the New Left as a hope. So here the students were, and they had tried to escape these two awful values of personal peace and fluency, and now their two hopes, the New Left and the drug thing, was gone. What were they left with? And they were left with apathy. Apathy. Many, many people were so glad when the universities quieted down at that time. And in one way, it's good. It did quiet down. But I could have wept, and I did weep as I met these young people after this. All they had left was apathy. And they had tried to escape their parents' poor values, or society's poor values, and they'd gone around in a circle and come back and ended 1 inch lower. And now apathy ruled with them, and what was left? The two values of personal peace and affluency now ruled supreme. Now, turning away from the United States, a dominant, strong minority in Europe and a majority of students, for example, let's say in South America and other parts of the world, they turn to a new leap into the area of non-reason. And that is, they committed themselves to the Marxist, Leninist, or the Maoist line. Why is this a new kind of leap into the area of non-reason, as utopian in a bad sense as the old drug leap? Well, I'll tell you why. It's simply because everywhere where Marxian Leninism has come to power, it has always meant oppression. Always. And these young people just close their eyes to that. They close their eyes to the fact that oppression is a part of the communistic system.
Бережность, и я бы сказал, та нежность.
No one has pointed this out more to us than Solzhenitsyn in his emphasis as he's brought it into the Western world in his writings and lecturings. And he has said that 15 million inmates of the prison camps existed at one time in Soviet Russia. He has said that from the communist revolution in Russia until only 1959, 66 million people died for political reason. So everywhere one looks in the communist world, it always brings forth internal oppression. But we must never forget, it also brings forth external oppression. We could think of various things, but the thing which quickly comes to our mind is Hungary and Czechoslovakia. I was living in Switzerland in November 4, 1956, when the Russian tanks moved into Hungary. And at that particular time, I had a radio with a shortwave band. All day long, I listened to the Hungarian students speaking in English, sometimes broken English, sometimes good English, hoping the external world would listen. I was marked by that day. I'll never forget it. Never. Those voices pleading for help. The newspapers, right after that, carried a picture of a beautiful, open-faced, lovely girl called Elon Troth. The picture was a picture of Elon Troth on trial for her life because of her part in trying to stand against the external oppression that Marxist-Leninism naturally brings with it. She was hanged on July 1957. Marxist-Leninism is a leap. It's a leap for another reason, or even a more basic one than the one I've given. Its foundation, its philosophy, is materialism. Now, all through this series, we've shown that humanism, man beginning from himself, cannot generate any real values or meaning or any real dignity to man. And here is a system that is built completely and consciously and totally on materialism. There is no place for the dignity of man in the materialistic system. So-called communism with a human face that some of the thinkers in communist-controlled countries have pled for, and some outside of communist-controlled countries have also pled for. It isn't possible. It just isn't possible on the basis of materialism. And yet, strangely enough, the young people and older ones in non-communist countries are caught by the idealistic Marxian-Leninism.
And it was my conviction after examining the different trends in parties and so forth that the Communist Party most held to those ideals. And was...
The reason is that there's so much talk of dignity. Dignity of man, be treated better.
In order to solve those problems and in order to give life, a meaningful and purposeful life to young people.
Where does this come from on a materialistic base? It doesn't. Do you want to know what it is? I'll tell you. And there's only one way to understand idealistic utopian Marxianism, and that is that it's a Christian heresy.
And in struggling against and condemning that which is wrong in the world, and Lord knows there's enough of what's wrong in the world.
Idealistic utopian communism simply reaches over, takes these words, which could never be produced out of materialistic philosophy, brings them back, uses them, separated from the natural results of their own position, and in doing so, catches these who are caught by idealistic Marxian-Leninism. But when Marxian-Leninism comes to power, it's a different story. It's always oppression, and the will of the majority suddenly has no meaning. Not only does the dignity of the individual cease to exist, but the will of the majority has no meaning either. Now we must understand there are two streams of Leninism, Marxianism. They must be kept separate, and we must see these two streams clearly. The first is the idealistic utopian stream. These usually young people, though sometimes older, who have leapt into the area of non-reason to accept Marxian Leninism. That's one stream. The second stream is the hardcore orthodox Communist Party members in various countries outside of the communist bloc. Now, we find that the danger is that people who have only the two values of personal peace and affluency, if they seem to be promised peace and affluency by communism, nobody knows what great majorities of these people will do. Nobody knows. More than that, we must see there's a danger in that these two streams of the idealistic Marxian-Leninism and the hardcore Marxian-Leninism Orthodox Party could flow together in a country at a given moment of history and create a situation that would be forever irreversible. And that is a very real danger.
Подобного рода опасность стоит и перед Соединенными Штатами в целом.
This type of danger is before the United States just as well.
The United States has also its marks very much upon it, and no more so in any area than in the area of the generation of arbitrary law. I want to talk about arbitrary law at some length, actually. Man demanded to be autonomous from God and God's revelation. And what this has resulted in is relativity not only in personal and public morals, but in law as law. The nature which men tried to build their law on, as we remember back in one of the previous episodes, just is not sufficient for the simple reason that nature is both cruel and non-cruel, and as such you cannot build a stable system of law on nature. And what we're left with, in the humanist flow today in the United States is purely variable sociological law. Now, by sociological, what I mean is law that is merely based on what some group decides is good for society at a given moment. The man who opened the door for this, perhaps more than anyone else, was Oliver Wendell Holmes. And he wrote in a letter, I'll quote him exactly, "The ultimate question is, what do the dominant forces of the community want? And do they want it hard enough to disregard whatever inhibitions stand in the way?" And this was Oliver Wendell Holmes quite a few years ago. And really what it amounts to is purely variable law. Much modern law is not consistent with the law that has preceded it. And as a matter of fact, we must say that the Constitution of the United States today can be made to say almost anything on the basis of sociological variable law. Now, we must understand that a law today is not just variable law, but that the courts are actually making law. They're not only interpreting the law that the legislative has made, but they actually generate law. Now, everybody knows who knows anything at all about these things that arbitrary law dominates completely in communistic countries. But what most people don't realize is that on the humanist flow, arbitrary law has swept over into the Western world as well. I'd like to use an illustration.
Consider the human fetus, the unborn baby. In January 1973, the United States Supreme Court passed the abortion law. Professor Witherspoon of the University of Texas School of Law writes, "The court held that the unborn child is not a person within the meaning of the 14th Amendment, so as to strip all unborn children of all constitutional protection for their lives, liberty, and property." This ruling by the United States Supreme Court is a totally arbitrary absolute. First of all, it is arbitrary medically. This book was put out with the cooperation of many noted scientists in this field, including some from the United States. It was to inform the British public. It favors abortion. However, it says that the question as to when human life begins is an open question. It, abortion, can be carried out before the fetus becomes viable, although when that is in itself an arguable point. It further states that a biologist might say that human life started at the moment of fertilization when the sperm and the ovum merged. The arbitrariness medically of the Supreme Court decision is underlined by the fact that the destruction of the fetus is accepted in abortion. And yet questions are raised as to whether it is right to fertilize an ovum outside of the womb, that is in the laboratory, because then it would only live for a few days. This points up the problem that if such a fertilized ovum were successfully implanted in the womb, that it would have the full genetic potential for becoming a human being. What does this make the 5.5-month-old aborted baby to be? Because it too has the full genetic potential for becoming a human being. Justice White of the Supreme Court, in his dissent concerning the abortion law, said that it is an exercise of raw judicial power, an improvident and extravagant exercise of the power of judicial review. Upon this arbitrary ruling, medically and legally, the abortion laws of almost every state in the Union were set aside. Most people accepted this law, even though it was arbitrary medically and legally, because it was considered sociologically helpful. Why would they not accept laws curtailing human freedom if these were considered sociologically helpful? What we're left with is sociological law, and that is all. And nobody knows where it will end. By this Supreme Court ruling, the unborn child is considered not to be a person. In our own day, there's been a great outcry, and quite properly, that in the past, the black slave was viewed as a non-person. But now, by this arbitrary absolute brought in the humanist flow, millions of unborn children of every color of skin are declared by law to be non-persons.
Now, a question has to be asked. In the day when there are no fixed values, why could not the aged, the incurably ill, the insane, and other classes of persons equally arbitrarily be declared to be non-person on the basis of arbitrary law if the courts thought that it was sociologically helpful. In a day like our own, what's unthinkable today might not prove, and probably will not prove, unthinkable in a very, very few years. Now, let's move on a bit. As the Christian consensus dies as the basis of our culture, society does not really have many bases upon which it has the possibility of building. One is that everybody would simply do their own thing. And this has the technical name of hedonism. It means everybody would do what they want to do. But the simple fact is that it is not possible to build a society on everybody doing what they want to do. One could think of a single man living on a desert island. He can do anything he wants to do within the form of the universe. But when two men are on that desert island and they have to have interrelationship, it is no longer possible for every man to do what he wants to do. I often think of the illustration of two men trying to do their own thing, regardless of what anybody else thinks, meeting on a narrow bridge. And as they meet on the narrow bridge, something has to happen. They both can't do their own thing. Everybody understands you can't build a society on people doing what they want to do, on hedonism. All right, then, hedonism is a theoretical basis for society after the Christian consensus is gone. But if it's not possible, what other possibilities are there? Well, there's the possibility of the total dominance of the 51% vote. Now remember, it was Christianity, the Reformation Christianity in the north of Europe, that brought forth the forms and the freedoms which we have, the 51% vote. But I'm talking about 51% vote after there is no absolute by which to judge the 51% vote. There was a time in the days when the Christian culture was more dominant, when the lone individual could stand up with the Bible in his hand and say, "You're wrong," even though the majority has voted the other way. But as the Christian consensus is gone, then there is no absolute by which to judge the 51%. And then this is a very, very different situation. I'll give you a sentence that I wish you'd memorize. If there is no absolute by which to judge society, society is absolute. The heart of the humanist thinking is making the individual man and then mankind the center of all things, his own measure, of making him autonomous. If we're going to live and escape death, not only death individually in the sense of the judgment of God, but death in our culture, in our political life, in our present life, we must turn from that humanist way of making man autonomous, and we must put the Creator at the center of all things. The greatest of all wickedness is putting any created thing in the place of the Creator. And when we turn from this, our feet are turned from the paths of death to the paths of life.
That was a pretty potent one, isn't it? It's interesting to see how he goes about this and talking about how, so much of the whole ideology of personal peace and affluency, and really so much of what happened and the reason why people rebelled against it was actually the realization that it really is horrible. And you can see that happening really in today's day and age where, we're actually kind of getting away from this. I'm actually thinking about, and this is just between conversations I've had just at work and stuff. I don't know how many of you guys are familiar, but like Walmart shut down a whole bunch of stores in Chicago. And I was talking with one of my coworkers, and somebody was bringing it up, and they're like, "Why doesn't they just need to leave them up there and help the people, and like they need to keep those Walmarts open?" And I'm like, "But they're like losing money because there's so much theft." And they're like, "Well, the CEOs should just take a hit on their money." It's like, well, I mean, that's all well and good, and in this ideology, like they're seeing the greed and they're saying, hey, we should be against this, but at the same time, it can't really be replaced with something else. And I brought up to them, I'm like, well, I mean, if you were stealing from your store, do you want to take the hit on your paycheck? And they're like, well, and they didn't really want to argue that point. And so I kind of brought them up to a point, like, are you willing to sacrifice some of your paycheck so that you don't have to do this? Like, what do you work for free? And they kind of don't really have this, but there's this whole ideology that's going around where I think we're coming back right around to where they are then, where those ideas only were able to go so far. They kind of died out a little bit. Personal peace and affluency, unfortunately, continues and is always going to be ideology that's going to stick through any type of humanist base. But it's now coming back around where we're like, hey, let's get rid of that. Like, people are realizing that that's a terrible thing to base a society off of. But without Christ, there is no replacement. There is no place for human dignity. And I find it interesting, and you guys have probably heard this, where so many people talk about socialism, and they're like, well, socialism has never really been tried in the way it's supposed to be tried. I mean, I don't know how many of you guys have heard that, where they're like, socialism, it's never really been tried out. And, what Francis Schaeffer brought up was a very good point. There's this high ideology of like this utopian view of everybody. Honestly, it's kind of like the whole Star Trek mentality of like, we're going to get rid of money and we're going to go to stars and just explore for the sake of knowledge. And, it's no longer going to be about, wealth and gain. I'm a big Star Trek fan, so I like Star Trek, but at the same time, I realize it's quite terrible ideologies that they're in on there. But at the same time, I think that's where we're seeing so many people have this same mentality where they're like, if we just could get rid of money and get rid of materialism, we'll all just seek knowledge and we'll just want to work just for the betterment of society. And it's like, have you met anybody in the back? Like, how many of you guys go out to work just to better your society? I mean, and what's crazy is this is really, you think about it, and is a Christian heresy. Because what did the early Christians do? When they first started out, it really was a communist society. When you think about it, the early church, right after Christ's death, they all went together and everybody's money was in one pot and they all worked together. And, he does not eat, does not work. I mean, he does not work, does not eat. I said it backwards. But that's really where they're taking this thing where they saw the early church and this, ideas, but they're trying to fit it into a humanistic perspective and get rid of any morality that we would want to have to guide us through there. And so it really breaks down, and you can see how they're taking these ideas that originally, remarkably, started out in the Bible, and they're taking them and trying to fit it into a framework where they're like, let's get rid of all forms of morality that would be behind it. Before I move on, does anyone have any thoughts or anything? I know this one and the next one, I really encourage you guys, like, if you have any thoughts, really try to share them, because you're really going to see some, I'm sure this is going to be very thought-provoking, this.
You remember John Lennon's song, Imagine?
Yes.
Okay. John Lennon is probably what a lot of these young people do. Let's get rid of a nation. Let's get rid of our possessions. Get rid of religion, and then we'll all be in peace. See where this is leading to on there? Imagine he's got quite an imagination when he says something like that, because that won't lead to peace, it'll lead to tyranny.
Oh, yeah.
You can see where he's coming from, Francis Schaeffer, on here. But basically, when we reject the absolute values of God, what does that lead to? It leads to arbitrary law, it leads to lawlessness. at least the philosophies that enslave us. These young people took up Marxism and communism. They blindly follow these things, thinking that will benefit them. They don't realize the people that are behind these things want to enslave them and destroy them.
Yeah.
And all you gotta do is look at history to see with Stalin, with Mao, and all those other individuals, how many people they killed and enslaved through their philosophy. So people are blindly following things they don't even know about. They're hoping to gain peace from these things, but they're looking in the wrong direction. When you take human beings and put them on the throne instead of God, this is what you get.
Oh, absolutely.
So you've got the solution obviously is Christ, but people aren't looking there.
Yeah.
They're
And that's
looking at
where,
other people.
and that's almost why, with this, I think just like that almost brings more of why, it should hopefully embolden us to be that light, to say, hey, your ideology doesn't go anywhere, but here's the answer. And I was just thinking about this. I heard this quote recently, and I apologize, I forget who originally said it. They were saying that today's society, we have a society that both they've said we've never had a society that both seems to both worship and fear death on an equal basis. And, both in that, we're so afraid because, obviously the whole COVID-19, everyone was like, oh my word, everyone's going to die. And then, and now you keep hearing more and more things coming up. We're going to have, they started trying to drum up some fear for monkeypox. And then, the next, and it's just, what's going to happen next. And then, but then on the same side, we're also, you look up to America's Hat here in Canada, already starting their euthanasia program. And basically, if you have their actual law says that if you don't feel like you can live comfortably within an acceptable means, or that you feel is acceptable. So literally, for any reason at that point, if you don't like the options you're given, you can just kill yourself. And the medical assisted suicide. And this whole thing where they're trying to, and then obviously abortion. Obviously, we've been seeing that crazy. Good, and I haven't seen the most recent numbers, but 3 months, I just want to encourage some people here. 3 months after the overturning of Roe versus Wade, there was 10,000 more babies in the U.S. So, I've heard numbers since, but I forget what the current number is. So if anybody's encouraged by that I was like super excited to hear that number. 10,000 more babies in the U.S. after Roe versus Wade was overturned than there had been before that. Yes?
I was just going to comment that it was interesting from the video. I guess, was the video made in the 70s?
Yeah, this was made in
1977.
Yeah.
So it was like the history that he talked about, the riots in '64 was recent history.
Yeah.
Marxism, he's talking about, it's like, wow, like 45 years later. Like, I've just experienced that in my lifetime 3 years ago.
That is true, yeah.
Same stuff almost.
Well, Marx and Lenin is still out there.
Oh, yeah.
Look at Antifa and their riots. They carry the revolutionary communist flag with them. Communists, that's their ideology. And what does it destroys people, destroys lives.
Yeah.
They have false hope.
No, yeah.
Just society just doesn't want to realize that there's almost sin. We're born in the sin nature, and that left to ourselves, we're selfish.
Oh, yeah.
And that, like us, trying to go socialist, they're the concept that everybody's thinking about somebody else, which are not.
Yeah.
They're not. And so that's why God put the Ten Commandments, because there's got to be some guardrails with that sin nature that we have.
Yep.
But yet they want to feel that they don't have to be by guardrails. They don't want to. That's ultimately why we go down these roads of thinking, fooling ourselves, I think.
Absolutely, yeah.
That we're better people because we're overall good people, and that we'll think of other people as we go on, which you don't.
It's remarkable when we have, so many people go and like that same idea, like people think we're better than we were in the past. And, I just think of like, they talk about like how terrible it was like with the Romans and the Colosseum. How could you kill all these people? Yet the most popular TV show for a long time there was Game of Thrones, and it's like, really, was that any different? Like, I mean, overly gory violence. Sorry if anybody watched Game of Thrones, then you should be offended. It was a bad show. Don't watch it. I have not ever watched it, but I had lots of friends who did, unfortunately at work. But but those kind of ideas, it's just amazing because we really haven't changed at all. Like, we just don't. And it kind of goes back to the very idea of like sin. Nobody wants to think about something as wrong, and so I just think of like the alcoholism. They're saying, oh, it's a disease. The person has a disease. It's taking away that the fact that the person made a choice that put them into a bad path. I mean, obviously, I think Pastor Mike could possibly speak much more confidently to how people have fallen away from this idea of choice and sin than I could with the whole counseling ministry. But, the people are trying to get away from this idea that we actually have sin in our lives and we have to be accountable to a God. I want to read this one last quote here for you. This is just kind of an amazing quote. How many of you guys are familiar with Malcolm Muggeridge? Anybody? Okay. He was a British writer, a journalist, and he had this in his book, Vintage Muggeridge, Religion and Society. He had this really great quote, and it's too long, I couldn't put it up there, but I want to read it to you quick. And this was written in 1985. He says, so the final conclusion would surely be that whereas other civilizations have been brought down by attacks of barbarians from without, ours has the unique distinction of training our own destroyers as its own educational institutions, and then providing them the faculties for propagandizing their destructive ideologies far and wide, all at the public expense. Thus did Western man decide to abolish himself, creating his own boredom out of affluence, his own vulnerability out of his own strength, his own impotence out of erotomania, himself blowing the trumpet that brought down the walls of his own city tumbling down, and having convinced himself that he was too numerous, labored with pills, scalpels, and syringes to make himself fewer, until at last he has educated himself into imbecility and polluted and drugged himself into stupefaction. He kneeled over a weary, battered old brontosaurus and became extinct. Now, he was actually referring to the fall of the British Empire. But you can see how I love that the very last term there, he has educated himself into imbecility and stupefaction. And again, I'm not trying to diss education, please. Don't think I'm doing that. But we have to be aware of what is being taught. And we have to be conscious of what is going on. Yes?
Yeah, the only thing I would question about that statement was that he made a difference between the fall of the Roman Empire and the British. And there's really no difference. The Roman Empire fell the same way. It fell from within.
Oh, yeah. You're absolutely right, yeah.
I think the earlier videos kind of explained that, too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this was a different person, too, Malcolm.
I think if we really look into all of the empires of the past, that's how they the Russians, the Soviets, the Russians, the same thing happened with them. They just, from within, they imploded, and better ideas, well, maybe not better ideas came in, but different ideas. Different conquests. But nonetheless, other than that, it was very insightful.
Yeah, no, and it was remarkable because much of the British Empire, the whole implosion of it was these people being taught that everything that they had been doing with their, reaching out to all the world was evil, and we were all evil, and they needed to recant of everything that they've been doing. Does that not sound a little familiar?
Aren't we imploding within in the United States? We are.
Well, we do have, and that's where we have that ideology that's being very prevalent. And again, this isn't so much that I want to change the nation. We got to not think so much that, hey, let's take this and now we're going to go politically and go out there. This is really about having the answers to speak to those on an individual basis, because if you're going to change the nation, you have to change the individual and you have to change the hearts, and equipping ourselves to being ready to witness to those around us and give them an answer, because as we see here, they don't have it. And when we know what they're looking at, we can better answer and be that witness to that world. All right, we're out of time here, so I better close up. Dear Lord, we just thank you for this day, and just thank you so much for this wisdom from Francis Schaeffer. And I just pray that as we look at it, obviously this is from years ago, but we need to get in and really see how we can be an effective witness to our world and to witness to the individuals, bring those to Christ. And that is how we would change a society around. But it has to start with being a bold witness and being able to stand for you and show the world we have the answer. They have the questions, but you are the answer to those questions. And I ask that you would just drive that in our hearts and our minds, help us to be ever more bold to those around us. In Jesus' name, amen.